So welcome everyone. This is our second talk of this year, if I recall, for the Expeditions Seminar Series. It's wonderful to see folks back again. Today we have the pleasure of having Baltazar, who's agreed to give a talk to the group. Baltazar doesn't need introduction in most ways. Most folks here know him, but even so, if they're new folks, Baltazar did his PhD at Arizona State University, and then he joined UVA as a postdoctoral fellow, but he's now a research assistant professor here. He has done some outstanding work over the last few years. He is Simon's academic grandchild, and that's it's a very important thing to say. Baltazar is going to talk about some very nice work he has done on role of human behavior and its impact on epidemics. I'll let you take it away from here, Baltazar. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you, Marav. So thank you all for joining too. I will talk about modeling social complexity in epidemiology, and particularly I will talk about a couple of projects where we consider the risk perception and the adaptive human behavior. This work has been funded by different agencies, and of course, this is a teamwork with a lot of colleagues and professors. Particularly, I will talk about the work that we did for these papers. I will focus on three main things. First, I will talk about airborne transmission or disease contagion in enclosed spaces. I will talk about modeling human behavior using a network-based approach, and I will talk about also a different framework that we have used, which is a framework that models behavioral response, but using an economic theory, and couple that with epidemics. So first, I would like to talk about how do we perceive dynamics across scales. So we can see this type of phenomena in biological systems, and we can see also this even in networks that represent some sort of artificial systems. So we can see this on the collective structures that are formed by ants or by fish, in which we observe some sort of behavior that is the result of the aggregation of things to reach some type of goals that may be not achievable by a single agent, but instead by the collective actions. They just tend to reach some sort of goals that it may take big effort for a single agent. For instance, in the bottom part, we can see as an example that sometimes some TikTok users that are not trained to solve crimes, they have actually been able to solve crimes before trained people actually find who was guilty. So this type of phenomena particularly represents some sort of dynamics that occurs between the agents and then how collective tends to aggregate and translate into a phenomena that we can perceive also at the bigger scale. This was in a beautiful way stated, particularly when we think about complex adaptive systems in which we can find feedbacks across scales. We can find that individuals, they have certain incentives, and that actually produce some actions at the collective scales. And this modulates the individual rules so that the whole system is showing this feedback between what we perceive at the population scale and what we perceive as the individual rules of behavior. And this was beautifully stated in a paper by Professor Levine in this paper of the problem of patterns and scale, in which he pointed out that one of the key things that we need to understand is how the information is translated into the different scales that we can observe. So we have a certain phenomena, and then we can observe it through different scales, and then getting to elucidate the rules that work at the individual scale, for instance, and then how that is translated into rules that work at the group scale or at the population scale. That is something critical. And particularly in epidemiology, we can think about the translation of these concepts when we think about what drives contacts at the individual level, and then how this impacts the epidemic evolution. So let me start with the first paper in which we consider dynamics across different scales. And we started with a very simple question. The research question that motivates this study was, how many infections do we expect after having a meeting? And this question actually was very important at the end of the COVID pandemic, because we wanted to go back to the normal schedule, having in-person meetings and all that. And then The question is what we can expect after having in-person meetings. Initially, we think about let's say, the obvious factors that will modify the number of infected people, which are represented by either the room size of the air mass and the ventilation. So how well is the venues adapted to having a meeting? But then after thinking about that, we realized that we also can have the meeting through different schedules, and then that will involve multiple time scales. In this case, we consider 4 different schemes in which we can have meetings. So we can have a single meeting during a single day, or we can have multiple meetings during a single day. Particularly, we can see that if we consider these 2 schemes for a meeting, so we don't only talk about the room size and the ventilation, but we also should think about the meeting lengths and whether we are having breaks or not. Then after that, we realize that when we talk about a meeting, not necessarily is just getting together during a single day. So we can have single meetings also during multiple days, or we can have, in the extreme scenario, we can have multiple meetings during multiple days. So in this scenario, we realize that we now enter into different factors, like having epidemics going on. So we need to track the number of infected people that is attending that meeting every day. So here you can see how different representations of the problem using different time scales will require to incorporate different dynamics and components here. So as the baseline scenario, for all these time scales, we need to consider what would be the viral load in the room. And then in the plot A, we can see, for instance, the viral load that is attained for the scenario when we have a single meeting per day during multiple days. So you can see how the viral load is increasing during the meeting, and then it just clear up because at the end of the day, nobody is in the room. But then the next day, they just come back again. The thing here is that the next day, we may have more infected people, and having more infected people sharing viral load, that will increase actually the speed at which the viral load is increasing during the meeting time. In the plot B, you can see how for different scenario, when we have multiple meetings per day, we can have the notion of having break times. We can have break times that will allow the viral load to decrease. And then for the different break times, we can see the very different dynamics that we can achieve for the viral load. So these are components that we were tracking. And in general, what we did with this framework is that we have the viral dynamics within the room that is represented by this plot here, in which we can think about the group size and the ventilation efficiency. And in here we have the transition of susceptible people to infected to recover, but we just maintain these numbers as fixed because the time scale for the viral load is faster than for the population dynamics. And then after we define what will be the dynamics of the viral load, we have to define what is the meeting schedule or the type of meetings that we are having. Either we have a single meeting and then we track the viral load as a single curve, or if we have multiple meetings and then we track the viral load with multiple curves, because we may have either breaks or we may have meetings that occurs during multiple days. So the viral load will clear up, it will go down all the way to 0. In both cases, we track the group size and the meeting length, but depending on the time scale, again, we may or may not have breaks time. The other thing that we consider is that if we have a long time meeting, meaning that people is attending during multiple days, we have to consider the population dynamics too, in which we are tracking the number of infected people. So we couple not only the model for the viral load that occurs during multiple, let's say, intermediate time scales, but we also track the slow progression of the epidemic. And we use a discrete time model here, so that during the initial meetings, we may have only 1 infected, and then after some days, we may have, let's say, 3 or 4 infected people. Then that will modify the initial problem by having more infected people sharing viral load. In general, so we were able to compare the trade-off that we may have with some type of responses and variables that we may find on the different scenarios. We may, for instance, have as a control variables, depending on the time scales, we may have, or we can modulate the group size. We have different masks or the room size. Either if people are required or not to use mask, the ventilation of the room, we can have break times, and in the extreme scenario, we can test people also, either to decide whether they are attend or not the meeting. So in this table, we collected the 4 scenarios that we work on. This is the type of meetings schemes that we assume, and then the control variables that I described previously. And then we were able to find this type of trade-off. For instance, in this case, let's focus on this scenario here. Like if we have short meetings, having breaks of 10, 15 minutes will produce a similar result than require 50% of the attendance to wear mask. So in this case, we are talking about 2 different responses that may result in a similar number of infected people. So we may require people to use masks, or we can just allow all the room to clear up the viral load that is being accumulated during 10 or 15 minutes, and that we will have similar number of infected people. This table is a summary of the whole table that we have in the paper. In the paper, we have more comparison of the potential controls that we can find with different time scales. And then in general, when we consider epidemics as complex adaptive systems, we can think about modifying the behavior of humans. So in this case, we can have the feedback that as people change their, let's say, their number of contacts, or if they wear or not a mask, or if they get vaccine or not, that will modify the epidemic progression, and then that will feedback on to what individuals do. In this other paper, we try to capture that in a very simple way. We formulate a framework in which we have a network-based model with 2 layers. One of them corresponds to the social layer, where individuals have non-physical contacts, which can be represented by social media, for instance. And in this layer, individuals decide whether or not to wear a mask based on 3 different mechanisms. So we have peer pressure, meaning that if we get an agent from here, so we can see that there will be some sort of peer pressure defined by their neighbors, let's say these ones here. So an individual may decide to wear or not wear a mask, depending on what he is observing from others. We have fear also as a potential triggering for wearing mask, in which the individuals look at the global prevalence. They look at what is the number of infected people in the whole network, and they just decide to wear or not if the disease prevalence attains certain threshold. And then we have prosociality, in which an individual just decides to use a mask because he or she likes to do it and he or she feels safe. So those are the dynamics of the social layer. And then the epidemic progression occurs in a different layer. In this case, we consider that contacts happen in the red layer in this plot. So there is a feedback between these 2 layers, because individuals deciding to wear masks, they change the probability of being infected. But then by changing the probability of being infected, that modifies the progression of the epidemic, and that feeds back onto the necessity to wear or not a mask. So what we found with this framework is that if we track the epidemic length since day 0 all the way to having non-infected people, we found that if we plot for different epidemic transmission probabilities, so there are no the dynamics here, we are plotting different transmission probabilities between agents, then we see that for low transmission probabilities, for low values, we see that the epidemics actually get a length of 300 plus. But there is a threshold after which something happens that produces that epidemics that are medium or highly transmissible, they are showing a shorter length. And in this example, this is because actually people, if we compare what we see in this plot with this one, that represents the average mask usage in the network, we can see that epidemics that are not highly transmissible don't produce that a lot of the individuals wear masks. But for epidemics that are highly or medium transmissible in this range here, we see that actually produced that bunch of the individuals, most of them wear masks. So that reduced the probability of infection. What follows is that the dynamics produced for epidemics that are not highly transmissible in this range here corresponds to these oscillations here. So people is wearing and not wearing masks depending on what they observe from others and the prevalence. And you can see that the epidemic lasts longer because we start having these oscillations here. If we compare that with epidemics that are highly transmissible in this range here, we see that people just react so aggressive so that the epidemic dies out very fast. In this case, we're considering scenarios where it lasts for 300 days plus, and then when it takes 100 days. The result of that is that if we compare the final epidemic size or the attack rate for these two scenarios, depending on different transmission probabilities, we may find in this plot here that the final epidemic size for viruses that are not highly transmissible in this region here, these produce higher epidemic sizes than others that may be more transmissible. Compare, for instance, this region here that produce these final epidemic sizes. These epidemics here are more transmissible than these epidemics here, but however, the ones that are low transmissible produce a higher epidemic size than compared to these ones. And that is, again, because the behavior occurs and people react so aggressive to epidemics that are highly transmissible. So the main result in this paper is actually this, that we may have epidemics that are highly infectious, but then since people react, that will produce a similar final epidemic size than an epidemic that is not highly transmissible, but when people don't react. So as a summary, when people react or not, that changed the whole game of the epidemic. If we think about epidemics, or if we use the metric of the final epidemic size to understand what is the process that is going on at the population scale, that is driven by the individual rules at the end. However, in this framework, we only use the current state of the epidemic and the current state of agents. So agents don't look ahead, don't look at the future, what is probably to happen, or they don't consider the past. They just consider the information that they have at time t, and based on that, they decide to wear or not a mask. And also, we only consider that people react in a binary way. They just wear a mask or not. So in this other framework that was published in 2010 by Eli Fennick et al., they develop a framework in which they consider that individuals can react by modifying their number of contacts, and they will include this economic perspective on the expected utility computed in a certain future. So the idea is to take the basic SIR model. The classic SIR model does not consider the number of contacts explicitly, but then we will do it here. We will have this structure now, in which we will be playing with the number of contacts at each time step. So we define the rules to do that, and that is based on the economic side of this framework. So we assume these economic conditions. We assume that utility is obtained through social contacts. So meaning that the contacts will define the number of utility that individuals get. And we assume that there are no incentives for infected people and recovery people to modify their number of contacts. They just do the maximum contact rates because that is what produces the maximum utility. So in this case, we need to understand what will be the behavior or the reaction of susceptible people, because these are the ones that will be facing the risk of being infected. So in this model, the response will be given by changing the number of contacts, and particularly changing the number of contacts of the susceptible population. In this case, we consider the optimal response, the response that balances the expected utility that individuals compute during a certain predefined future or the planning horizon. And then that will be balanced against the risk of being infected. So the risk of being infected will produce some penalty in the utility that infected individuals receive. And now the question is how the contact structure change as the epidemic progress. So we can see as a summary of the framework, let's say that we are on time t. So we are here on time t, we know what is the disease prevalence at time t. And we have all these susceptible groups in general. We may not only have a single susceptible groups, we may have n susceptible groups that may perceive the risk of being infected in different ways. But in general, a susceptible individual will try to maximize at every time step their expected utility. And that expected utility will be maximized during a certain planning horizon, and that will depend on what others are doing too. Right? So they compute the expected utility, and to do that, they formulate this dynamic programming formalized by these Bellman's equations here. These are the Bellman's equations that corresponds to the simple SIR model in which a susceptible individual is trying to maximize or to find the contact rate that maximizes the expected utility, and the expected utility during the planning horizon is composed by the immediate utility, okay, this term here, and is composed in part by the feature utility. So you can see there is a discount factor here, and we have also the probabilities that will be weighting what is the expected future state of an individual, whether the susceptible individual remains susceptible or whether the susceptible individual gets infected the next time step. And this is complemented by the Bellman's equation for infected and recovered ones, but this does not account for the maximization process because we previously assumed that this will only maximize the contact rates. So what we do at every time step is that we solve this set of Bellman's equations. We find, based on the maximization problem, what will be the optimal contact rate for susceptibles time t+1, and then we go back. So at every time step, we are finding, based on the probability of being infected that are defined by the epidemic prevalence at time t, or a t+1 or a t+2. So that defines the probability of transition for susceptible people to different health states, and that modifies the optimal contact rates as the epidemic progress. So what we have out of this framework is that the behavioral change that we observe will depend on what is the risk perceived by susceptible people. And when I say risk perception, I mean that we may impose different balance between the benefits and loss of susceptible people. So how individuals value their contacts, we use that as a proxy to the perception of risk. So in this case, we have that if people is highly sensitive to risk, that will produce a strong response. Meaning that, for instance, in this curve here, we have the disease prevalence, and then we have this in this other plot, the contact structure associated to this disease prevalence, and the disease prevalence is associated to this contact structure. So both of them evolve at the same time. But compare the red curve, dashed red curve, when the contacts remain fixed. That means susceptible people are not aware that there is an outbreak there. They just maintain their number of contacts the whole time. And notice how if we include some low or high sensitivity, that will produce different contact structures that at the end, it feeds back on the disease dynamics, and that reduces the peak size.
Baltazar, can I ask you a question? Something I didn't understand.
Sure.
I thought you said it depends on how individuals value their contacts. Is that what you said?
Yes, it depends on the utility function that we are using.
Yeah, so does that take into account, for example, I may want to avoid contact with my boss, but I don't think I can because those contacts are extremely important to maintaining my job or something of that sort.
Right. Yeah, in this case, we are assuming that all the contacts are homogeneous, but we can include that in a more structured utility functions. So far, we have a single dimensional utility function. It's a single peak utility function, but then in the future, that will be great. So there will be some contacts that I can drop off, and there are other contacts that I cannot remove.
Right. I've never seen those in models, but I think that's really probably pretty crucial as to help people make decisions as to whether they can afford to avoid contacts.
Yeah, there are different limitations. We can think about the economic part also. Some people can reduce a lot of their contacts. They just can't afford it. Then others can do it. So these are two examples that we can use to define a more complex mechanisms to compute what will be the optimal contact rate of individuals at each next time.
Right. As you say, it might be just a function of the individual herself as to whether she can afford to, I'm staying home today because it doesn't matter if I go in, but other people have to show up at work. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question and great comments.
Baltazar, Simon, if we use compartmental models, one extension I think Baltazar might talk about is we had looked at folks who are risk takers versus non-risk takers.
But looking at something that has to do with the wealth in the society, wealth distribution or something of that sort,
right.
That's probably a more powerful. Certain people just can't stay home from their jobs.
Mm-hmm.
You and I can.
Right. I'm just saying that you started in the direction of breaking down into more compartments, and I think your idea is perfect and we can accommodate it.
Yeah, in the next slide, I will show an example where we work with that. So first, we take the simplest example that we can find, and then the idea is behavioral response is always beneficial. And the answer is, as usual, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. There are some different ways to cheat on the behavioral response. For instance, if we have asymptomatic people, and then what we did is that we formulate this epidemic model in which we have susceptible individuals. We have exposed one. These are individuals that they can infect. And then we have asymptomatic one. And these three, we assume that they behave exactly the same because exposed individual and asymptomatics, they may not know that they are infected. And other people, since they are not showing symptoms, they may not know that these two are infectious. So we compute the contact rate for susceptible ones, but we also use that contact rate for exposed and for asymptomatic people. We use two different compartments for infected people. Some of them may have prosocial and some others don't. The prosocial infected individuals, they reduce their contact rate by certain amounts because they just would like to be nice with others. And then people who is not prosocial, they just don't care. They just care about maximizing their utility. And of course, recover people. So the whole framework deals with all these equations for the epidemic progression and these Bellman's equations to get the optimal contact rate for susceptible people. And what we found using this framework is that if we consider different proportion of asymptomatic people, say sigma is the proportion of asymptomatic ones, if we have 30% of them versus what we get if we have 60% of them. So you can see that particularly if we look at these plots here, this one and this one, having few asymptomatic people will produce that most of the individuals will be symptomatic, they will be showing symptoms, and that produces an aggressive response on reducing their number of contacts. But if we have a lot of asymptomatic people, the behavioral response is not that aggressive. That will impact on the progression of the whole epidemic, and particularly will impact on the final epidemic size. So compare what we get, the final epidemic size here versus the final epidemic size here. So in general, we found that the presence of asymptomatic people reduced the response at the population scale, but also there is a trade-off between asymptomatic people and the reduced infectiousness, because during the COVID pandemics, during the early times, we didn't know what was the and I don't think we know at this point what is the infectiousness of asymptomatic people, because that depends on their activity level and that depends on the intrinsic infectiousness. So if we compare the final epidemic size that we can get with this model and no modification of contacts, we see that the attack rate or the final epidemic size, as we have more asymptomatic cases, and if we assume that asymptomatic ones are more infectious, the final epidemic size always go down at this gray plane, and the gray plane corresponds to this point here, no asymptomatic and no infectious asymptomatics. If we consider the modification of contacts, we can see that we have a nonlinear behavior here for the final epidemic size, in which if we consider having asymptomatic people, and then as we assume that they are increasing their infectiousness, we see that there is a region where the final epidemic size actually goes over the scenario of not having asymptomatic people. This is the region where asymptomatic individuals actually make contacts and transmit the epidemic. and susceptible people are not aware that these people are infectious, so that it produces a higher epidemic size. So even though people is reacting, they are reacting to the presence of symptoms, but asymptomatic people don't show symptoms. And this is the way that we may have a higher epidemic size. We also studied what is the role of the planning horizon over which susceptible individuals compute the expected utility, and we found that there is an optimal planning horizon. If we let individuals to plan ahead during the short periods, they tend to underestimate the impact of being infected, while for long planning horizons, they tend to, again, underestimate. But this is because they are balancing big periods of being recovered or being not infected, so that the expected utility at the end is optimal only when we assess in a right way what will be the impact of the infectious period. So in this case, we found that the attack rate is minimized for asymptomatic individuals, and regardless of their infectiousness, the attack rate or the final epidemic size is minimized for a planning horizon of 3 weeks. In this case, we assume an R0 equals 2.4, but if we modify the R0, that will modify the progression of the epidemic, and this will impact on the optimal planning horizon too. So the optimal planning horizon depends on the progression speed of the epidemic, and that will impact on the computation of the optimal contact rates too. Finally, with this framework, we also consider a population that have high risk and low risk people, in which if we consider that a proportion P of the individuals are risk takers, meaning that they have a different value of their contacts, they tend to not reduce that much their number of contacts, there is a trade-off between the proportion of people that takes risk and the reporting level. We assume that the reporting level just reduce the perceived prevalence. And in this case, you can see in this plot here that if we have a lot of risk takers in the x-axis, and if the reporting level is increasing, we find that having low reporting level produce similar results in terms of the attack rates than having a lot of people that is risk averse. So this plot here is a counterplot of this 3D plot here, and it's basically showing this region here, this curve here, in which we are plotting the different final epidemic sizes that we can get for different population structures in terms of risk takers and risk averse people, and for different reporting levels. So you can see that the population structure matters in this case, in the sense that people will react aggressively or not in these two susceptible groups, and that will depend on the reporting level. That will depend on their perception of risk, what is being used to compute the probability of transition from susceptible to infected. The next one is an ongoing project in which we are using this framework also to incorporate multiple immune stages, in which we may have initially susceptible people, they can get vaccine or not, they can get infected first time, even they get the vaccine, they can get infected also, they can recover, and they can infected by the second time, or they can get reinfected. After that, we consider that in this model, we can have 3 different groups that modify their number of contacts. We have the totally susceptible ones, the vaccinated ones, and the susceptible with some sort of immunity, because they went either over the vaccination or over first infection. With this, and using mobility data, we were able to calibrate our model based on the mobility data for different states. I'm just showing 3, New York, Massachusetts, and Washington. We use this data to calibrate what will be the risk sensitivity, and we wanted to study what will be the dynamics of the epidemic during a long period if we consider that individuals react to the presence of infected ones. And then we found that if we compare this plot here, plot A, in which we consider a naive model where people don't modify the number of contacts, versus if we have people modifying their number of contacts based on the prevalence, we found that when people modify their number of contacts, they tend to balance the inter-epidemic periods, and they tend to produce uniform waves for the epidemic. So here you can see that depending on the immunity level granted after the first time infection and reinfections too, you can see how the epidemic tends to have big and low peaks here. For instance, when epsilon is 0.7 or 0.8 versus in this case, that it tends to follow a certain structure. Also, we found that when we consider epidemics that are composed by different immunity levels, meaning that individuals that may have different immunity after first-time infection or vaccination, behavioral response tends to equalize the epidemic dynamics. In this plot, we can see the epidemics for different immunity levels, and then this will correspond to different probabilities of being infected, and that defines different contact rates for susceptible people. And this is where the balance occurs, because if people feel that it's highly susceptible or is not that susceptible, then they will tend to adapt in a very strong way or in a weak way the number of contacts, and that will produce epidemics with different underlying immunity landscapes will exhibit very similar dynamics. With this, I will finish, and I would like to thank you all for listening. So thank you. I will take questions or comments.
Have you thought about how dosage response or leaky protection might impact some of these systems or some of these modeling efforts in terms of non-uniform, infectivity and then propagation of subsequently like lower viral loads relative to the antagonistic effects of non-pharmaceutical interventions that could, I'm thinking also of like the utility function that you showed, like the future utility function. There could be some partial benefit to low dose exposure that carries forward in a systematic way and those kinds of things.
We haven't done that, but that's a great one. Actually, that will require some sort of model of within host dynamics, and then incorporating other structures that we haven't tried yet. But that would be great. Thanks.
Yeah.
So, Baltazar, much of the work you described, the first and the last parts, I guess, were largely compartmental models. Mask-wearing part was a network model. What are your thoughts on how to extend the other models into a network-style model, and what sort of challenges do you see?
That's a great one. Actually, yeah, we've been working on that during the last time, and we already extended this model to the network-based approach. And the challenge there is that for each of the susceptible nodes, we have to compute the optimal response, so that we are running a dynamic programming approach for each of the susceptible nodes at each time step. And the structure of the dynamic programming problem, even though it's the same for all of them, the characteristic changes because it depends on the neighborhood structure. So that we have to incorporate what is the number of susceptible neighbors, the number of infected ones, and recovered ones. So basically, we got some results. So far, the main idea of the epidemic evolving depending on the network structure is very, very nice results that we don't see that on the ODE models. And we can obtain what will be the individual-based mean effort on reducing the number of contacts and contrast that with the population scale effort. We don't have that also on the ODE model. So there are many things that we can explore with the network-based approach, and hopefully we get it as a future work.
I think it will make the problem very rich and computationally intensive too, because now you can talk about local information, and you can think about how to incorporate that in adaptive behavior. And that makes the problem really interesting, because all kinds of questions, such as the one, say, Simon brought up, also can be brought in, right? Whether I depend on my friends, my edges with the bosses, my ability to move somewhere, all of this can be picked up now in the structure. It's just very expensive because to run these forward dynamic programs. But the reason I prompted Baltazar to say this is that perhaps this is one area where surrogate models might provide a way to do this computation effectively in the long run, so that we don't have to run the dynamic program for each agent completely every time. All right. Thank you to Baltazar again, and plan on meeting in 2 weeks from now.
Goodbye. Thanks very much, Baltazar.
Thanks, Baltazar. Good job.
Thank you. Thank you all.